afternoon. I'm Alan Winters. I was until a few days ago co-director of the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar, one of a series which the Centre provides. The idea is to discuss international trade policy with people who know all about it and have got interesting things to say. That absolutely characterizes today's webinar. It's going to be given by Dmitry Grozoubinski. Dmitry is a former Australian diplomat, I suppose, but a trade negotiator, and is currently executive director of the Geneva Trade Platform, a think tank. He does a great deal of training, making stuff accessible, and indeed you very frequently will have come across him in the press and indeed in the media. It's a great pleasure to invite Dmitry to give the seminar. He recently published a book called Why Politicians Lie About Trade, and that's a provocative title. And the title of today's webinar is Trade Choices and Lies. Welcome, Dmitry, and off you go when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Professor Winters, and thank you to CITP for hosting me. I wanted to talk a little bit about the book, but mostly to sort of unpack some of the reasons I wrote it, where I think we're coming from, why it's important, and where we go to from here as a community of people with an interest in trade policy and an interest in active participation in governance, effectively. The book, as Professor Winters said, is the main title is Why Politicians Lie About Trade. To be completely honest, that wasn't my original draft title. And the book is far less of a polemic than that title seems to suggest. There were certainly days where I considered writing a book that was exclusively a re-litigation of every Twitter fight I have ever had with someone with a verified sticker next to their name, and to go back punch by punch through the last 5 years. But I don't think that would be hugely interesting for anyone to read, and I don't think that would be a hugely helpful contribution to the discourse. Even where it feels like there should be accountability for things that people have said about trade policy in the past that didn't prove to be true, I'm not sure I am the one who is going to provide it, and I'm not sure our discourse is particularly set up for that kind of thing anyway. Instead, what I've tried to do through the book is a couple of things. I wanted to provide an accessible guide to our world. Many of us who, especially those of us who kind of work in trade policy every day, can sometimes struggle to explain, well, what is it exactly that we do? Where do we fit into the global picture? If there are goods moving around, if there are services moving around the world, if there are trade lawyers and freight forwarders and giant container ships, well, what is the role of those of us who are on the trade policy side? And why does the work that we do matter to real people? Why do the choices that our work implies matter to real people? So I wanted to do my best to try to translate in terms that someone could use around the dinner table some of the things that we grapple with every day in language that hopefully doesn't require 5 additional layers of follow-up. And those of you who do read the book, I'd be fascinated to hear how well you think I did, and whether you do think this is something that you could read out loud in a pub and have people broadly follow the discussion. But secondly, I have this perception that trade policy and the choices it involves are going to be a bigger and bigger issue in our discourse in coming years. I'm going to talk through why I think that is, but my fundamental observation is that there are simply going to be more choices to be made with more radical consequences. That, for me, matters in 2 ways. First, there's the individual choices themselves. When our political leaders, when influential commentators, when business leaders, when civil society present policy options to the public, it's obviously good for democracy for people to understand what those choices are and make some sort of informed decision about which way they will lend their voice, which way they will, how they will perceive those. So there's the choices themselves. But I think more broadly, given that we live, for the most part, at least in the West, we tend to live in representative democracies where we don't outside of Switzerland tend to vote on too many individual issues, and instead we every couple of years are presented with options of who we would like to make choices on our behalf, which leaders we will entrust with the powers of government in order to essentially steer the ship of state, and with very little ability to micromanage what they do outside of those election periods, as I think those colleagues joining from the UK will have discovered. And so when that is the case, it is imperative that we, over the course of both elections and between them, have a real understanding of how our potential leaders approach choices. What are their values? And to the extent that they roll out policies, what can we infer about the trade-offs they are willing to make and how they would navigate those trade-offs when presented with two choices? And I think as trade policy becomes more prominent in the public debate, as there are bigger choices to make, for me, it's really important that the public be able to properly pass the choices at hand in order to, beyond just weighing in on those individual choices, in order to properly understand the values, mindset, and motivations of those who are leading or who would seek to lead our democracies. That is a very kind of grandiose introduction. I'm not suggesting my book is here to fix democracy, but if my little patch of trade policy is going to become a bigger part of the national conversation, then my book is a little attempt to try to make that conversation better informed and to equip the public to better pass what is being discussed. The book is in two parts. The first half of it tries to basically lay out what trade policy is, and the second half of it talks about how trade policy and the choices involved in trade policy affect some of the things that I think are closer to the public's heart, whether those are trade and the environment, whether there's a trade and national security, whether it's jobs, women's economic empowerment, development. I try to go through some of the big issues that tend to come up in a trade context and effectively lay out how I at least go about passing what I'm hearing about those subjects through a trade lens. And I try to make you laugh along the way with, mixed results and, dubious success. It is trade policy. Professional comedians will say that you can find comedy at the bottom of any well, but I am not a professional comedian. I am just a trade geek. So your mileage may very much vary. So that's kind of my preamble and my very limited pitch for the book. You can see how sort of deeply uncomfortable I am pitching. But hopefully that gives you a sense of at least what I was trying to do, and helps you understand if this book might be for you. But I wanted to kind of move off the book and talk a little bit about how I think we got to a point where trade policy is a bigger part of the conversation, but our conversation is not particularly equipped to pass it and adjudicate it the way we are perhaps some other fields. What we're basically seeing now in terms of the change that the global trading system is going through, specifically around trade policy, and what I think that means for us. And when I say us, I am talking about the kind of person who joins a trade policy webinar hosted by CITP, halfway through a working day. So someone with an active interest in the intricacies of this stuff and how it and participation in governance. So that's kind of the framework I'd take. I want to be very candid. I have no idea if I'm going to fill the time. I strongly suspect that I won't. So I really hope that this does turn into a conversation and a discussion. I really would encourage you to kind of pepper myself and I'm sure Alan with questions through the Q&A box, because that's frankly I far prefer engaging with folks than I do monologuing. So with that, just some introductory thoughts to hopefully stir the conversation. So how did we get here? And that's sort of a fairly broad question. But I think to understand where we are now, you have to look at the last couple of decades. And what was happening in trade policy and the trade policy conversation. We had a couple of phenomena. One, and I think this is a Western phenomenon, but it's sort of fairly universally true. We had a period of what I would call comparative stability, in the sense that there was the establishment of the World Trade Organization in 94, 95, however you want to call it, the transition from the GATT to the WTO, heralded in a couple of a decade and a half maybe, where not that much happened on trade policy. Most countries had liberalized a good chunk of what they were comfortable liberalizing. There was a sense that everyone had protected their sort of precious little walled gardens that they wanted to protect, whether that is certain kinds of trucks in the US, agriculture in the EU, and what have you, Japanese rice. So there was a sort of walled garden sense. Okay, they kept that flexibility there. And there was a sense that trade policy wasn't necessarily where you turn to for dramatic change. There was a kind of incrementalism where countries were certainly seeking to do free trade deals. There was a proliferation of investment agreements and free trade agreements. But for the most part, these were about incremental improvements on top of a fairly stable and broad status quo. So we had that kind of stability. And on top of that stability, we had, at least in the West, a form of bipartisan consensus in major economies around the fundamental tenets of trade policy. So whether it was Republicans and Democrats in the US, UK and Labour, the Tories and Labour in the UK, the Conservatives and Liberals in Canada, the Labour and the Liberals in Australia, wherever you kind of turned, I think this is painting with a very broad brush, but fundamentally, you had more or less a consensus. You had different appetites for pushing liberalization significantly further. There were individual hot button issues like investor-state dispute settlement. There were individual flare-ups over issues like the original labor provisions in NAFTA. But fundamentally, you sort of had this bipartisan consensus that liberalization was good up to a point. We should incrementally increase liberalization where we are comfortable. The predictability of a rules-based system where you can broadly trust that no one is going to flip the table and knock all of the chess pieces to the ground is preferable to whatever individual kind of table flippy policies you might be tempted by. So you had that consensus and you had that rolling along. And when you have bipartisan consensus, I think what you get is an atrophying of the muscles of public debate. The media generally, I think, struggles to cover something that does not have two sides. There is not a lot of story to be had in something where both sides are broadly supportive or whether the opposition doesn't markedly disagree with the government. And so there was kind of a loss of expertise. This stuff wasn't making the front pages. Specifically in, I think, the UK and in a lot of Europe, you had this phenomenon buttressed by an outsourcing of responsibility. The European Union's sort of centralization of trade policy competency was in many ways very convenient for EU member state governments. Everything could be the fault of Brussels, while any win could be claimed domestically. A lot of the expertise moved from trade ministries in capitals into DG Trade, and into sort of the Brussels ecosystem. Businesses in capitals tended to gradually downsize and eventually smart size out their trade policy professionals, or in government advocacy roles, and move those into either Brussels or focus much more on kind of individual, very niche regulatory questions that weren't at the sort of level of what we tend to consider trade policy in like the macro. And so I think that led to an outsourcing of expertise as well. And then on top of that, I think governments benefited from an ability to use the existence of the rules as a bulwark and scapegoat to push back on demands for additional support from stakeholders that they didn't want to accommodate. I think a lot of, if you talk to a government affairs folks who sort of had experience, for example, in the UK through Brexit, there was this sense that they would ask for things only to be told that would be illegal under WTO rules, or that would be a breach of FTA negotiations. And so there was this sense that the rules could effectively be a shield that you could use to defend yourself against stakeholders who wanted you to do more than you were prepared to do, or to avoid a kind of opening the door to every stakeholder with a foghorn demanding special treatment, protection, or subsidy from the government. And so that kind of contributed as well. And so what you ended up with was a trade policy discourse that was quite separate from all but a very few stakeholders. So any of us who have worked in sort of missions to the WTO in trade ministries will tell you that generally our experience has been that trade policy will often be shaped by a very small handful of business and civil society representatives who basically just kept turning up while everyone else stopped. There was a strong squeaky wheel gets the kick phenomenon in trade policy all over the world, where you tend to focus on the interests of a few powerful vocal lobbies who have still invested the resources to follow what's going on, make their voice heard, and come up with rhetorical frameworks that can effectively sort of convince the public or convince decision makers. So that's my long background of where I think how we got to where we are, what are the kind of complacency terms that have led to a debate that is rife for misleading rhetoric and an obfuscation of the choices made, painting with a very, very broad brush. What we're seeing now is governments all over the world, including many who effectively built the system and the rules in the first place, and who until very recently, and in fact may still be, describe themselves as champions of free trade, champions of predictability and agreements between governments. we can see a phenomenon whereby they are increasingly dissatisfied with the status quo. And they're dissatisfied with it in a couple of ways, and this is not going to be an exhaustive list. But I think first and foremost, I think it's clear that there is growing dissatisfaction with the way that competition is distributing manufacturing jobs. Now that's a giant can of worms, and I'm not going to unpack it on this call. But I think fundamentally it comes down to whatever you ascribe the reasons for this phenomenon to be, whether it is the natural functioning of a market pursuing genuine forms of legitimate comparative advantage, like lower labor costs, like economies of scale, like well-functioning logistics and positioning along critical supply chains, or whether you believe that this is some governments putting the thumb on the scales and prejudicing those decisions in order to effectively change the calculation and make their territories a more attractive place to build things. You are seeing governments are not satisfied, especially in the West, with where factories are going and where factories are closing. Again, the reasons for this are there are very, very good books written and very, very good reports, including by CITP, on kind of everything that is to unpack there. But there is that dissatisfaction. Secondly, I think governments are dissatisfied with the potential of liberalized free trade to create perverse incentives in areas like environment and human rights. There is a perception that the way the system is set up, which generally focuses on saying you can do what you like on your territory, and at the border, you should be the kind of barriers you put in place at the border should be about protecting your own public and your own environment and not sort of maintaining a global standard. That was sort of the general architecture. There is a sense that that no longer strikes the right balance, that the potential gains from environmental negligence, whether that is producing carbon in places where carbon is not taxed or credited, whether that means deforestation when we need to preserve the forests, whether that means mistreating, whatever you like, disposal of waste, any number of these policies that can be maintained in foreign countries, that we are reaching a point where regulations in our economies are reaching a level where the disparity between those and what other countries may maintain may be providing them a form of comparative advantage to manufacture or produce goods and services elsewhere that we can't match. That effectively we are regulating ourselves out of business while not contributing any net benefit to the globe, because we are simply outsourcing the environmental damage we are doing through this incentive to manufacture elsewhere and sell back to us. Now, again, the actual science on the extent to which this is happening is conflicted and complex. But there is certainly that perception among governments, and it is an incredibly powerful narrative. It's very difficult to push back on something that is so intuitively true. It feels like that should be happening. The extent to which it is or has happened yet varies from sector to sector and industry to industry, but it certainly feels like it should be happening, right? And then I think there is also a sense that this kind of rules-based framework, whether that's free trade agreements or the multilateral rules-based system, the WTO, these kind of grand deals, are effectively cramping the style of governments in a fast-changing world. The architecture that we're used to building is that we spend a couple of years as governments negotiating a grand agreement, whether that's at the World Trade Organization or in a region like with a free trade agreement. And through that agreement, we effectively both make all the parties make commitments not to do things. We take a guess, we paint a mental image of what we imagine the future flexibilities, the future policies we will want to have are. And more importantly, we take a guess about what are the policies we definitely aren't going to want to roll out. And that's where we make commitments in exchange for a set of commitments from the other side. That's what a trade agreement is. It's an exchange of promises not to do things. Increasingly, governments are feeling like that is too restrictive a model because we can no longer predict the kind of policies we will want to reach for in our toolkit. We simply don't know. In a world where sort of AI has gone from science fiction to the sidebar of our browser in under a couple of years, where technology is changing so quickly, where geopolitical tensions kind of ratchet and rise up, we simply do not know what are the policy tools we will want to reach for. A really practical example, one of the foundational agreements of the World Trade Organization after the GATT is the agreement on agriculture that put in place, for the West, relatively generous limits on agricultural subsidies, including effectively numeric limits. So the US is allowed to spend about 19.4 billion per annum on what the World Trade Organization considers more trade distorting forms of support, like direct subsidies and whatnot, price support, that kind of thing. From the US perspective, they're looking down the barrel at a potential trade war with the People's Republic of China, and they now have some experience following the retaliation to the Trump tariffs of saying, well, where are the Chinese likely to hit us? And they're going, well, agriculture is going to be a big one because, well, for a bunch of political reasons, they will do what they did before and simply stop buying our soybeans. Under that circumstances, the US is looking at that agreement and going, we may need to spend a lot more than 19.4 billion. We were perhaps even foolish to sign on to a limit like that because we may need to wage a trade war with China and spend a lot more than that. So that's sort of one fairly emblematic example. There are dozens of these across services, across goods, across agriculture, what have you. So governments aren't kind of clear on what are they going to need to reach for. And in fact, they are feeling increasingly hamstrung and stifled by the rules they did sign up to, especially because when it comes to one country, the US, and to an extent the European Union, they don't believe that those restrictions apply in practice as much to them as they do to China, which they view as less constrained by the system for a range of reasons. So with that kind of picture, what does that mean for those of us who are trying to inform the trade policy debate, trying to make the trade policy debate more based on evidence, more based on a clear understanding of pros and cons, and just generally improve the discourse? I think it means a couple of things. The first is that we simply cannot rely on, but it's against the rules, to hold the line anymore against policies we don't like. It is simply not a compelling enough argument anymore to walk into a minister's office and tell them that what they are doing is against the letter or the spirit of their commitments in a trade agreement, unless you can also tell a story about the practical consequences of that beyond simply the sort of reputational or systemic implications of a derogation. This is especially true in the US, but I think it's going to be increasingly true everywhere. There is this, it's very Trumpian, it's very Russian to say, okay, it's against the rules, and so what? What will actually happen to me? What will the actual consequences be? And so we can't simply rely on legalism as a trump card in a way that I think we could for a while, when that was a persuasive case in all but the most extreme situations. I also think, and this is kind of similarly, I don't think to the extent that it was ever persuasive, a maximizing efficiency framework, a sort of pure economic argument about what is the optimal policy to pursue in favor of GDP growth is going to be persuasive. I don't think it necessarily ever was. I sort of make this point in the book, and I don't mean to disparage economists by it, but I just don't believe that the public is hugely swayed by big 10-year models of GDP impact. It's too abstract. And the notion of, well, we should pursue the policy that most efficiently uses resources and distributes labor is simply not going to be persuasive anymore to the extent that it ever was. We can certainly talk about the most efficient way to achieve specific objectives, and I think we should speak in those terms. But a simple maximization of GDP, while I think it can be laudable, I don't think that is going to help us support the debate. We can sometimes get tricked by this because we'll put out GDP numbers and they'll sort of get retweeted a lot and they'll be used in headlines, and that feels like we're making a persuasive case. But in my sort of limited experience looking at the debate, that kind of support is fingernail deep. You scratch that and you discover that it's simply your people who already agree with you weaponizing your figures to use as a cudgel, and those who disagree with you, no one who doesn't already disagree with you is necessarily swayed by that, especially because inevitably there will be competing numbers from someone that they can take up and thus grant themselves a permission structure to ignore you. I think we are going, and I'm almost done, I swear. I think we are going to have to do, as people in this space, we're going to have to do a lot more accepting of the premise. So when the US comes to us and says, I am deeply concerned about China and the potential of having to fight a war against China, and therefore I want to take trade policy steps to set up for that, in order to engage with that, we are going to have to accept their premise and sort of engage with them in some ways on their own terms. We can't simply push back using the models of before. If they are saying that they face an existential threat from a disparity between their own manufacturing and China's, to come back to that and go, yes, but Chinese manufacturing is good for consumer prices, or it's the most efficient, or they're specializing and we can specialize in something else. We'll sell them Hollywood movies and financial services while they make all of the widgets. That is not going to work because we are simply not meeting them where they are. We are we will be right in a lot of these cases, but the way to engage is, in my view, to say, okay, you've identified the problem, let's zero in on that. What specifically is the problem you're trying to address, and what would success look like? What do you want to prepare the country to do? And what would an adequate level of preparation look like? Does it mean the ability to instantly convert to a war economy? Does it mean being proof against the most obvious forms of economic leverage? Does it mean being able to withstand an economic blockade? Does it mean doing so unilaterally? Does it mean doing so with partners? I think we are going to have to accept but probe the premise of some of these questions. Okay, so you want to fight climate change and you want to prevent our industries leaking abroad. What does that look like? What are you really worried about? What's a fair way for someone to prove that their factory abroad is as green as yours? What's a fair level of documentation and verification? How can we make sure that this conversation isn't just captured by our existing businesses who don't want to face competition of any kind? How do we have that conversation, but have it on, I guess, on the playing terms that are being set for us? And I think academics and researchers are going to have a special responsibility moving forward to make sure that they are communicating their findings well, accessibly, and in a way that is responsive to the current discourse. And some of that will have to come from academics themselves, and some of that will have to come through partnerships with think tanks and other groups that know how to do this. But you can't, if something is on the front pages today, there is no shortage of uninformed people willing to weigh in on it. The newspaper column inches will not wait 8 months for you to complete a comprehensive study and get it peer reviewed and then publish a sort of incomprehensible 92-page journal article about it. That has value in and of itself, but it's not necessarily to the discourse. That has to be paired with a dynamic engagement in the discourse. And sometimes, unfortunately, I think that engagement will sometimes have slightly less scientific rigor than we would ideally like. It is going to be a bit of sort of, based on what I know, that's not quite how this works. And so this is going to be a fine line to draw. But I think, institutions like CITP walk this line incredibly well. A combination of being responsive and in the conversation while still thoroughly academically rigorous. For me, that's the exact sweet spot. There are other institutions in the UK that do this really well. UK in a changing Europe, the Institute for Government. These kind of organizations that pair academic rigor with dynamic, accessible engagement are going to be really, really important, in part to push back against people who don't necessarily sort of reach for rigor at all, but don't let that stop them engaging. And so I guess my final thought is that I think we as a community are going to have to simultaneously think in headlines while still remembering the footnotes. And that's kind of the broad message this rambling rant hopes to leave you with. Hopefully at least some of that was interesting and led you to some food for thought. You're very welcome to push back on me and call me names.
Thank you very much, Dmitry. We won't call you names, at least not just yet. So let me say to participants, the question and answer panel is open. While we're waiting, Dmitry, maybe I can sort of pose a question. Why this focus on manufacturing? I mean, in the UK, it's 8% of GDP. In the US, it's only, is it 16%, something like that? Most of us work in white-collar professions, and indeed our parents are pleased when we go into white-collar professions and so on. So what is this salience about manufacturing?
So I think there are probably three things going on, to paint with a broad brush. It's a really good question. The first one, the absolute kind of steelman argument here is that for countries with national security concerns, there is this sense that if it ever comes to having to make 2 warships a week and 100,000 artillery shells, it is much easier to convert a car factory than it is a McKinsey consultancy office. So that is sort of one argument. It's a fairly new one. Until the war in Ukraine, I don't think anybody was that seriously contemplating having to make 100,000 artillery shells a week in a hurry. But there is that argument. Secondly, I think, and this is legitimate, the distribution of where manufacturing jobs are and the nature of manufacturing work does, I think, make it in some ways potentially more important locally and individually than services jobs. What I often the picture I often paint is, if you have a small town that effectively grew up around one large factory, and then the subsidiary manufacturing and services employment that service that factory, and that factory is filled with workers who have been there for a couple of decades, and that factory closes, you have significant local impacts because the linchpin of that economy is pulled out, and you have significant individual impacts. because, and this is vibes, not science. I might be entirely wrong here, but I think it is a person who's been working at a factory for 20 years is less immediately locally transferable than someone in a white collar job in a big city. An IT profession, there are lots of IT jobs in any place that has IT jobs. Generally speaking, there are at least more. There isn't a second factory next door that is hiring 500 workers. The churn factor in cities is higher, and so there's this sense that services businesses closing is less of a blow. That may be fair or unfair, but I think that's the perception. And also, I think there's an optics element to it for politicians. For better or worse, manufacturing workers just feel like they're doing real jobs compared to those of us who are just like email workers. And, I'm an email worker. I don't think that's, you can have different opinions on whether that's fair. But like somebody working with their hands in a hard hat just feels like a real worker, whereas can't really describe what it is I do, and it sometimes doesn't quite feel real. So I think though that's kind of the universe of political salience, local and individual relevance, plus the strategic kind of long-term thinking of why it's important to specifically have a manufacturing industry. And by the way, all of this also applies to farming as well, in all of similar ways.
Okay, thanks. I have a few questions now, so I won't pursue that, although at some stage we might talk further about it. A question from Rosalind Riley. Expertise in government seems to be unpopular. The trade political personnel degraded in terms of understanding trade. Is this populism sort of running riot, I suppose, through our trade world?
I don't think that's necessarily true or fair of the UK. The UK is a special case because you folks had to staff up incredibly quickly. The UK Department of Business and Trade, or as it was called, DIT, seems to employ every man, woman, and child in the country. And they've certainly spent a lot of money building up that expertise. So that expertise, I think, is there and it's growing. The challenge is, first of all, that the UK doesn't pay its senior servants hugely well on a global scale. And so it can be hard to retain that expertise when there are competitive offers from the private sector and abroad. So that's a challenge. And a second challenge is that ultimately civil servants do get the message from the top. If a minister is fundamentally disinterested in detail or wants to be told certain things, that is the message that gets passed down through SPADs. And it is very hard for civil servants to ultimately ignore what gets you an accolade from the minister's office and what gets you an attaboy, and thus what is good for your career versus what gets you considered a nudnik and a naysayer. So I think that is helpful. If there is a change of government in the UK, I hope that the incoming government adopts a healthy attitude towards its civil service and doesn't begin from a premise of these are interfering saboteurs who don't believe in our project. I think that would certainly be helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. A question, go back to one from Michael Gazurek now. I guess he's asking in the sense, do you think objectively the situation is that the rules of the world trading system are too constraining, that we do actually really need to adopt other policies? Or is it that governments just want this because they found that it's politically convenient to blame dastardly foreigners for whatever it is they possibly screwed up themselves?
For the most part, I think my general view is that if, as a government, you can't figure out a way to do a policy you really want to do within the letter of the WTO rules, you're not thinking hard enough or not paying your lawyers well enough. The WTO represents a global consensus of commitments. It is a lowest common denominator set of treaties. The flexibilities in it are generally a mile wide. Now, with that said, there have been narrow places. So, for example, the US very clearly believes it should be able to use anti-dumping to protect its market against what it sees as unfair competition in individual sectors, far more than the WTO appellate body's interpretation of the rules in various disputes against it have ruled is legal. So on individual policies, I think there is a sense of constraint, but I think more broadly, there is a reaching for the easiest policy rather than thinking hard about what would actually be useful. And the easiest policy can often be in contravention of the rules. I'm sorry if that's sort of that's a me wearing both hats answer. I'm being a little bit coy.
Okay, a question from Leo Verity. We expect we're going to get a Labour government. The Labour government perhaps is rather less interested in free trade agreements than the current government. I mean, although frankly, that's changed a lot over the last 4 or 5 years. But what do you think the issues are that the UK ought to be thinking about if, in a sense, there is a change of regime? What are the 3 big issues, for instance, that you think the UK needs to face?
So I'm going to stretch the word exciting to beyond breaking point, and transmogrify it in real time into useful, rather than exciting, perhaps. So first of all, the UK should be putting a lot of emphasis on the design of its carbon and environmental policies, and specifically thinking about how those will plug in and interface with the European Union's policies, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism and the Circular Economy Directive and all of the other things that EU is doing, making sure that the UK is not inadvertently discouraging, sort of disadvantaging its own businesses vis-a-vis their European competitors, and really critically making sure that it still makes at least some sense to build a supply chain that goes across the UK and Europe at the same time. Because the UK will benefit a lot from being able to draw on the individual comparative advantages of individual EU member states. It always has before. It should continue to do so, even outside the single market and customs union, leaving which has made it hard. So that's one. Secondly, and this is where it gets really, these two are much less exciting, or at least this one is less exciting. I think the UK should put a much greater emphasis on market access and investment promotion. And when I say market access, I don't mean negotiations to lower tariffs. I mean working on the ground in countries the UK trades with to help the UK companies that are exporting navigate their border bureaucracies and overcome the barriers that they face. The UK is already doing this. It should really lean in because border regulations are only going to get more complex. And the more help you can provide businesses in unlocking that shipment at the port, the more you can really directly change people's livelihoods and business fortunes as a government. That's not sexy, but it's really important. As is telling a good investment story about the UK as an investment destination. You can no longer coast on being, don't quote me, the sanest people in Europe to establish a business in. You can't just be like, we've got rule of law, we've got a lot of capital, we've got good services, and we're in the European Union, because you're not one of those last things. And frankly, your recent record on rule of law has also raised some eyebrows. You need to tell a good investment story about why I should be opening an office or plugging money into your startups. And the UK can do that. That's a trade policy thing. It can do that. And then finally, and this maybe gets sexy again, navigating the geopolitics. When the US and China start slugging at each other with subsidies and trade border measures and sort of thinking about nearshoring, onshoring, how does the UK position itself within that dance? How does it make sure it doesn't end up directly competing with an industry that is chosen by one of these behemoths as a national champion and just flooded with subsidies and government support? You can't go punch for punch with the US Treasury. You can't go punch for punch with Beijing's resources, how do you fit in alongside those industries? How do you make the thing that goes into the thing? How do you make sure you're still an attractive supply chain component? How do you navigate those tensions? So that's where I think UK trade policy should be focusing. You're not going to be able to focus too much on FTAs if for no other reason that you're rapidly running out of potential FTA partners. You've kind of done an FTA with almost everyone it makes sense to do an FTA with, that wants to do an FTA with you, that it's kind of has any chance of being concluded.
Okay, thanks. That's quite an agenda. Thanks very much, Dmitry. So I sort of chided you a little bit for focusing on manufacturing. You did just in passing mention agriculture. So a question from Fiona Smith, who's here now in Sussex. What does a decent international agricultural trade policy look like? Is it just quitting on the WTO agreement on agriculture, or do we muddle our way through pragmatism, is the polite word? And if so, in a sense, what does pragmatism involve?
I think there are people on this call who are far greater experts in this than me. My very limited answer would be, the way that I tend to look at this is, as climate change gets worse, we are going to experience more phenomenon where individual parts of the world are experiencing shortfalls in agricultural production, including places that have previously been fairly reliable producers, while other places are not or are experiencing boom conditions. So one thing that we have to kind of lean into a little bit as in agricultural policy is making sure that it remains easy to move food around. And one area that I know that I've heard others talk about before far more widely than mine is, for example, certification of various GMO strains. So we are constantly coming up with new type crop varieties that are resistant to certain new forms of climate change effects. Each of those has to get individually sort of regulatory certified in order to move around the world, and global structures aren't keeping up. So we are facing a potential situation where a country is short on food because of bad conditions in its traditional suppliers. Another country has a surplus it could theoretically export, but is unable to do so because the type of wheat they've made has not been accepted into entry, and there is no scope to expedite that process quickly. So thinking about the mechanics of a world in which supplies are less reliable and we have to sort of trade facilitate the movement of agricultural goods is going to be increasingly important, as is making sure that we thought through how can we keep farmers going if they have 2 bad years in a row because the climate has gone crazy.
Thank you. A question from David Barnes. In a sense, the existential question is the rules-based system sustainable? It seems, it's falling out of fashion in a number of places. But the kicker in the question is, would it matter? David says, look, China and Russia hadn't been part of this system for very long. Maybe actually it's a little bit overrated. Maybe we could do without it. Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. So Russia matters very little. We can kind of discard that. Their trade profile is comparatively modest and dominated by petrochemicals or sort of oil and gas, which basically don't have anything to do with the world trading system because people don't put tariffs on oil and gas. It's just this like bulk traded commodity, so you can set that aside. I think potentially this rules-based system may not be sustainable. There's a pessimistic and an optimistic version of this. The pessimistic version is it's not sustainable. We're just heading for a free-for-all. These countries are going to they're going to reject the notion of most favored nation so that it shouldn't matter where you get your goods from so comprehensively, and they're going to want to intervene so much that basically the whole system becomes redundant. That's the pessimistic answer. I think a more optimistic answer, and where I still fall, is that what we're headed for is that, but in a walled garden. Governments are going to choose a range of sectors or even products which they view as strategically significant and in which they are prepared to ignore the rules. But that is going to be focused on a subset of, your cars, your steel, your solar panels, your chips. These are really important, but you're going to basically have a free-for-all brawl between the major players there. And then there's still a chance that everything else can kind of continue as it is, because that predictability in other sectors does benefit all parties. They don't want to be fighting this war on 6,600 tariff lines at once. They want to fight it on the things that they view as vital to their ongoing security or their ongoing prosperity. So that's kind of my more optimistic system. My more optimistic system doesn't matter. It matters most to the non-behemoths. If you are the UK, if you're Australia, if you are, for God's sakes, Lesotho, the rules and the predictability are significantly more valuable to you because you have less ability to bilaterally push through an outcome through the sheer force of your market and sort of hard and soft power than the EU, the US, and China are.
Indeed. Okay, thank you very much indeed, Dmitry. I guess we have more or less reached the witching hour. I promised a hard stop at 2 o'clock, so we'll execute that. Let me just say, look, it's a great pleasure to have you. It's very provocative. I'm going to have to go and sit in a dark room and think about lots of this stuff. So thank you very much. I hope everybody else has enjoyed it. Thank you for coming. We'll see you next time. And thank you again, Dmitry.
Thank you so much to CITP and to you, Professor Winters, and to your team, and to everyone who joined. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.